Imagine being at the peak of success, surrounded by wealth, fame, and admiration, yet feeling an impossible-to-fill void deep within your soul. This was the dilemma of Lev Tolstoy, the man who wrote some of the greatest works of literature, but whose spirit yearned for something far beyond applause. Despite conquering the world with War and Peace and Anna Karenina, Tolstoy found himself trapped in a desperate search for meaning, a need to uncover a deeper truth that could calm the internal storm that tormented him. What happens when the greatest success is not enough? How does a man face the abyss of existence? Today, I invite you to discover the fascinating journey of Tolstoy in his search for the meaning of life, a path that would challenge not only his own beliefs but those of an entire world. And yet, deep in his soul, he was drowning. No literary success, no adoration, and no material wealth could silence the troubling questions that tormented him. Why do we exist? And why is everything destined to end? What happens after death? How can one live in a world filled with suffering? These were not mere abstract philosophical musings for Tolstoy. They were urgent existential dilemmas that consumed every moment of his life. He found himself paralyzed by despair, questioning whether anything he had achieved had any real meaning. But his existential crisis was not just a personal struggle. It was a revelation, a roadmap for anyone who faces the terrifying void of meaninglessness. Tolstoy did not settle for passive despair. He embarked on an unrelenting search for truth, exploring religion, philosophy, and the wisdom of common people. His journey took him away from the comforts of aristocratic life and led to a profound spiritual transformation. In his later years, he renounced his wealth, rejected his old beliefs, and sought solace in a simpler, more ascetic life. His struggles and insights offer a timeless lesson. Even in the darkest moments, there is a path toward meaning, but it requires the courage to question everything and the humility to look beyond oneself. Most people believe that money, success, and relationships bring happiness, but what happens if you achieve all of that and still find yourself staring into the abyss of despair? Tolstoy's journey was not just that of a writer who lost his way. It was a reflection of the human condition itself. His crisis was not an accident, but something inevitable, and by facing it, he discovered something most will never dare to seek: the truth about the meaning of life. Leo Tolstoy was born in 1828 into the Russian nobility. His early years were privileged but turbulent. He lost his parents at a young age and inherited the vast estate of Yasnaya Polyana with hundreds of serfs. From the outside, it seemed as though he had been handed a fortune in life, but inside, he felt restless. He threw himself into gambling, drinking, and fleeting relationships, trying to fill an invisible void. However, no matter how much pleasure he sought, guilt and dissatisfaction persisted. Writing became his escape, his way of imposing order on the chaos of existence. He meticulously worked through his thoughts in journals, obsessively documenting his efforts at self-improvement. His literary career took off with works such as Childhood and the Cossacks, deeply imbued with his personal experiences. The brutality of war, which he witnessed firsthand during the Crimean War, shaped his narratives and moral reflections. Then came War and Peace and Anna Karenina, masterpieces that solidified him among the greats of literature. His ability to capture history, philosophy, and the human soul was unparalleled. The world hailed him as a genius, but Tolstoy felt an ever-growing emptiness. He had achieved everything, but he felt more lost than ever. When he turned 50, an unbearable sense of emptiness overtook him. He had a loving family, vast property, and worldwide recognition, but he felt like a man who had climbed to the top of a mountain only to realize there was nothing there. What was the point of striving, building, and achieving if death erases everything? If life is just a temporary flicker in an endless void, why bother at all? These thoughts consumed him, growing like a shadow over every aspect of his existence. No matter how hard he tried to push them away, they came back with more force and oppression than before. The life he had once valued, the admiration of his readers, the love of his family, the beauty of his estate, began to seem like a prison rather than a blessing. He could no longer find solace in what had once brought him joy. His fame and success, which should have been sources of pride, only deepened his despair, making the emptiness inside him even more unbearable. His interest in his family, his work, and even in daily life faded. The pleasure he once found in writing vanished, as if his very ability to create had been taken from him. He sat at his desk, pen in hand, but the words seemed meaningless, lifeless. The warmth of love, The laughter of his children and the tender presence of his wife felt like distant illusions, echoes of a world to which he no longer felt he belonged. He disconnected from those around him, retreating more and more into his own mind, trapped in an endless cycle of unanswered questions. Every conversation, every routine seemed like a farce, a performance hiding the unbearable weight of his inner suffering. He was tormented by the idea that life had no real purpose or final destination. If it all ended in death, what was the point of anything? This thought became an obsession, a dark cloud that pursued him relentlessly. It grew so unbearable that he even contemplated ending his own life, convinced that oblivion was the only way to escape his torment. He feared his own impulses so much that he removed the ropes from his house to avoid temptation, afraid that a moment of weakness might lead him to do the unthinkable. He was trapped in an unanswered question, or so he thought. But deep in his despair, a new understanding began to emerge, one that would change the course of his life forever. In his desperate search for meaning, Tolstoy turned to philosophy. He studied Socrates, Buddha, Schopenhauer, and many others. Each thinker offered him ideas, but none quenched his existential thirst. Schopenhauer's nihilism only deepened his despair. If life has no meaning, why continue? He turned to science, seeking answers in logic and reason. He read Darwin and explored theories of evolution and biology. Science explained how life worked, but it did not answer why it existed. If humans were merely a random product of natural selection, it meant that everything was an accident. Could it be that there was no higher purpose? Tolstoy saw that people face the absurdity of life in four ways. Some simply ignore the problem, living as if questions about meaning do not exist. Others seek pleasure, using distractions like money, sex, and entertainment to silence the approaching void. Some fall into despair, believing that suicide is the only way out of the lack of feeling. And then there are those who live in limbo, trapped in indecision, neither fully embracing life nor completely rejecting it. Tolstoy spent years oscillating between these states, but there was a fifth path, one he had missed. The peasants possessed something that neither philosophy nor science could offer, a framework for meaning that transcended individual logic. Their faith was not rooted in knowledge but in trust, not in doctrines but in a deeper purpose that couldn't be understood through reason alone. As he observed those around him, something struck him as odd. While he and other intellectuals grappled with despair, tormented by the meaninglessness of life, the peasants, farmers, and laborers carried on with an unwavering sense of purpose. They were people who worked from sunrise to sunset, their lives marked by physical toil and uncertainty, yet they didn't seem to share his existential anguish. Their days were simple, their possessions few, but they laughed, loved, and greeted each new day without the crushing anxiety that haunted the upper classes. What made them so different? The contrast intrigued him. He saw wealthy aristocrats, academics, and philosophers, people with access to the brightest minds of their time, wrestling with the same questions that haunted him. They debated endlessly, seeking logical answers, but none of their reasoning offered them the peace they so desperately craved. Yet, the ordinary people, those with little more than the clothes on their backs and the fields they worked, seemed content. Without complicated theories or intellectual justifications, they lived as though they knew something Tolstoy and his fellow thinkers did not understand. Tolstoy became obsessed with discovering the secret behind their quiet and steadfast inner peace. What was their secret? He watched them closely, spoke with them, and listened to their stories. Over time, he began to notice a pattern, something he had overlooked due to his aristocratic background. They had faith, not blind belief nor passive submission to religious institutions, but a profound, intrinsic connection to something greater than themselves. Their faith wasn't rooted in abstract philosophy or theological debates, but was interwoven with their daily lives. They prayed not out of duty, but out of genuine reverence. They didn't fear death as Tolstoy did, for to them life wasn't a meaningless accident, but a part of a grander, eternal narrative. At first, this realization unsettled him. For years he had dismissed religion as mere superstition, something to comfort those unable to endure the harshness of reality. He had witnessed the hypocrisy of the church, the corruption of its leaders, and how doctrine was used to control the masses. To him, faith seemed like an escape from the truth, rather than a route to it. However, the more he reflected, the more he realized that the peasant's faith wasn't about blind adherence to dogma, but something far deeper, something that intellectual reasoning could never touch. He came to understand that religion wasn't just a set of rigid doctrines or the opiate of the masses, as some critics had claimed. It was a bridge between human limitations and the infinite unknown. These people didn't need to understand every detail of the universe to find peace. They trusted in something beyond themselves. While Tolstoy and his intellectual peers wrestled with their inability to find definitive answers, the peasants had already embraced a different kind of wisdom, one that doesn't require solving everything through intellect. Faith, he realized, wasn't about explanations. It was about transcending the bounds of reason. It wasn't a weakness, but a form of strength, an acceptance of life's mysteries, rather than an attempt to reduce them to logic. This shift in his thinking was profound, and both disturbed and intrigued him. If these simple, uneducated people had found peace through faith, perhaps he had been searching in all the wrong places. For the first time in years, Tolstoy felt a glimmer of hope, the possibility that there might be a way out of his despair. This realization didn't change everything. Tolstoy renounced his material wealth and sought a simpler, humbler life. He devoted himself to serving others, choosing humility over prestige, and aligning his life with something greater than himself. In surrendering his ego, he found peace. Tolstoy's crisis and transformation offer powerful lessons. Meaning is not something we acquire through external success, but something we cultivate within. Rationality alone can't answer life's deepest questions. At some point, we must move beyond reason and step into faith, whether religious, philosophical, or spiritual. Simplicity, humility, and service to others provide a sense of fulfillment far more profound than wealth or fame. Tolstoy's story is not just the existential struggle of one man, it's a universal experience. At some point, we all face the void. The question is, what will you do when that moment comes? Will you numb yourself with distractions, fall into despair, or dare to seek something deeper?